hard to introduce someone who needs no introduction, but I will give it a shot. I am extremely honored to introduce John Willis from our sponsor, Red Hat, today. John is a DevOps legend. He's built 12 different startups. He's written almost as many books, including Beyond the Phoenix Project. And today he's going to talk to us about how to automate governance. Take it away, John.
Hey, hello everybody. This is John Willis. I'm doing a presentation today called Automated Governance, an overview. I actually work for Red Hat, as you can see, part of the Global Transformation Office. And so a little bit about myself, for people who don't know me, I go by the Twitter handle Loop. I've been in this industry for quite a long time, 40 plus years. I've written about 10 or 12 books over the years, but these are the most recent ones. Co-author of DevOps Handbook, co-author of a book that I collaborated with Gene Kim called Beyond the Phoenix Project. I've also done this really interesting forum paper, which really is a lot of the material that we're going to cover in here today. In fact, those two books, the DevOps Automated Governance and the Automated Cloud Governance, are a lot of the stuff I'm going to cover today. So those two are both Creative Commons. And we'll make sure that you get some links to be able to find them. The DevOps Automated Governance you can find on itrevolution.com. Quick thing about my background, I'm not going to tell you about my 40 years. It would take the whole presentation, but sort of from left and right. Today I'm at Red Hat, and I'll talk about what I'm doing at Red Hat. But more recently, I sold a company to Docker a few years back. It was in networking, so I spent some time at Docker. Sort of they hired a hurricane. I was early in at not the actual founder, but part of the founding group of Chef. Back when we began, it was the 8th or 9th person there. I had a company that was a multi-cloud management company that I sold to Dell. I've done a lot of startups. I've done also about 10 or 11, I lost count, startups over the years. Most of them miserable failures, by the way. But the last 5 or 6 years have been very good to me. I also did one of the first private clouds. This is pre-OpenStack at Canonical. I was an executive in residence in between startups at one point for KeyBank, and I started my career at ExxonMobil. And also was involved in some of the original discussions of DevOps days. In fact, Andrew Clay Schaefer, Damon Edwards, and myself were really the progenitors of the first DevOps day in the U.S., and I was the only American at the first DevOps day in Ghent. Yeah, and some of the things about the Global Transformation Office, I've introduced the players here. But we came on board at Red Hat, and typically the four of us were not traditional Red Hat, sort of RHEL people. As I said earlier, we've been heavily involved in the shaping of the DevOps movement, not by ourselves, with the shoulder of giants and lots of people. But the idea was, how could we infuse, and so one of the things that we talked about, we came in October last year, is, this, at 2020, or at the end of 2019, right? Like, we've done a great job. DevOps is good. I would say the glass is half full. We should really, I'm not kidding, pat ourselves on the back. We've changed commerce. But the question is then, all the goodness we did in 10 years, what are we going to do for the next 10 years? And, if we're talking about GitOps and we're still, if you look at CI/CD 4 or 5 years ago, that was novel. Today, it's table stakes. So a lot of what GTO is about is helping the industry. And Red Hat has given us this great opportunity with all, open transformation, all the great things that Red Hat has, if you haven't looked lately, we have, really good distribution, OpenShift of Kubernetes, just a lot of sort of really well-rounded enterprise solutions. And how can we really, as thought leaders with the combination community, Red Hat and our DTO team, sort of drive what the next 10 years should look like. So we're really excited about that. I think it's a little bit of shift in how Red Hat has been perceived and how Red Hat, and I applaud them for taking the chance on this team. And so basically in this presentation, I'm going to cover really 3 main areas. I'm going to talk about some surveys and how surveys relate to some of the trends. And then I want to talk about the battlefield, right? What's out there? What are the things that we should be thinking about? How do we learn from talking and having conversations, organization, to get to a level of truth? not just saying that the breach was caused by one person. How do we actually dive a lot deeper? And then the last section is really based on the title of this presentation, is really diving into something that we've called automated governance, either automated DevOps automated governance or automated cloud governance. And just, when we use the terms, from a GRC perspective, governance, risk, and compliance, I have found that in IT, these are very overloaded terms. People have different contexts and meaning. So when we talk about governance here, we're trying to associate how we take the risk profiles that we have, institutionalize an organization, and show evidence of how we are able to show the evidence. So from an audit, and how do we match back to our governance, risk, and compliance models that we have institutionalized for organizations. So, and again, I know some people call it continuous compliance, some people call it automated compliance. So for this case, you'll see how we focus in on governance.
So to talk about automated governance, I wanted to start with some of the survey data. It's sort of, sometimes when you look at survey data, you can look at it one of two ways. One, you can look at it as like, oh, that's just survey data, and it's reports and stats and all the sort of jokes about stats. Or you can look at it as, is it helpful in seeing some particular trends? So not taking the data literally, but understanding the data. So that's what I'm going to try to do this morning, because I think there is some really interesting surveys that have been done over the last couple of years, specifically around the topic of DevSecOps and something called the Software Supply Chain Report. So there's 2 years now, there's been a survey called the DevSecOps community survey. And, it's about 5,000 respondents. So it is an echo chamber, but one of the things that during that survey they were able to identify is really three sort of respondent stages of people who respond to the survey, that let's say about 50% call themselves immature in this sort of notional DevSecOps, and then a much smaller subset are in the what we would call mature, so 15%. And I'm going to use some of this in some observations of some of the other data from this report. So the first thing is, this was part of that survey where they asked questions about deployment. So when you talk about DevOps and even DevSecOps, right, a big component of this, and most people listen now notice, is how do you deliver software? How do you do it in terms of your pipeline, your CI/CD, your software supply chain? And then, we do notionally capture how often you deploy. Sometimes as an industry, we over-rotate on that information, but sometimes it can be useful in understanding where an organization is and what sort of the implication is. From the data here, if you notice, it says 55% are sort of in that weekly time frame, but I dissect this a little bit differently. If you look, I would say, here we got sort of less than 20% are really iterative in the way that we'd like to see high-performing, or from some other surveys that I'm not going to include here, where you classify high-performing organizations that deploy multiple times a day. And so really, it's a little interesting that a majority of the people in this particular survey are out of that realm of daily deploys. And in fact, only 7% are sort of every change. That means they're iterating out of it, sort of very efficient layer. This doesn't mean you're bad or you're good. It's a perspective. I always love the quote from Mary Poppendick, which is, how long does it take you to get one line of code through your system, right? And so you can take that to sort of DevSecOps. How long does it take to get a hot fix or a vulnerability correction or patch through your system, right? So, and again, I'll just round. I'll say 50% of the industry is really in sort of the waterfall mode here. And these are people that were respondent in a DevSecOps survey, right? So, it's, I wouldn't say it's depressing, but it's interesting. If we further look, I think this is another really interesting graph of what's going on. And again, my interpretation of this is a little different from what they do. So if you remember the discussion about mature versus immature, if you look on the left-hand side, the gap between mature and immature is shorter, is smaller, right? And so that would tell me that these are the industry. This is sort of table stakes. Do you have a WAF? Are you doing IDS, intrusion detection? Are you doing static analysis security testing? But what's interesting is when you get into the things that are in the box, like container security, dynamic analysis, security testing, software component analysis, composition analysis, the gap is much higher between mature and immature. And so this relates to my experience in the field. I will tell you that most companies would probably identify themselves as immature in sort of a DevSecOps mindset. I mean, some people think if they're just doing vulnerability scanning, they're mature, right? But that's sort of nonsense. Most companies that are, really sort of evaluating where they're at would probably say they're immature, even though they're doing things like at the perimeter or WAF, or they have, open source governance. And the ones that would consider themselves, in my opinion, mature are the ones that are saying, and I take this in relation to the software supply chain or the CI/CD or the pipeline. Are you doing DAST or software component analysis or interactive application security testing in the pipeline? And again, notice the gap is really much higher there. So it just tells us a little bit of data about where we are, that the truth is most people are not doing sort of more advanced stuff in the software supply chain. And again, it's a survey, so we take all this with at least a grain of salt. Another interesting data point, which, I hear a lot, I go in an organization and they're reasonably savvy on all these topics, but they'll say, but John, the developers think if we do security, it's going to slow them down. Or operation, so you have this sort of still global mindset in a lot of organizations. The security means that, that it's going to slow down efficiency. And unfortunately, the data from this particular survey year over year reflects that. There is not a big change in the respondents from 2018 all the way to 2020, right? One of the last pieces I think I have in this deck is that part of the survey was 85% of your code is sourced from external suppliers. There's a large bank that's public on the record, but I'm not going to mention who they are. Where one of the top fellows in this organization was asked by the CIO. So this is a bank that has about 18,000 Java developers. They're 85% Java based, highly big development organization for sort of in-house development stuff. And this fellow was asked by the CIO how much open source they did. The answer was 99% of all the code that they wrote from like 18,000 developers, 99% was open source. And here's the kicker. They were only using 10% of that 99%, right? So we have a lot of interesting challenges, if you will, in this space. So the battlefield. One of the things I spend a lot of time, and I've done this after probably the last 4 or 5 years, is I typically come in an organization at the CIO level. What happens is usually there's somebody at an influencer level or a chief of staff who will go to the CIO and say, you really should listen to this guy, John Willis. I don't know why they say that. I'm only kidding. So I get a chance to talk to the CIO, and the CIO says, how would you help us? And I'm like, let me just interview your people. So I've been doing this for a few years where I'll go in and I've done some banks. I've done 2 or 3, I think 3 of the top 15 banks in the world. One bank I spent a month, at their location. I interviewed 350 people. And I find there are these patterns. And so I call them organizational conversations, where I literally just try to talk to the people who do the work and find out what they think about, not what management or leadership or some consulting organization told them what they're doing. Just ask the people. Go talk to 100 or 200 people, earn their trust, and let them tell you how things work. You'll find more about an organization. And I've called this the 7 deadly sins of DevOps. 7 because it's a cool number, but more importantly, these are common categories that I see over and over, and it's just a way for me to bucket the conversations. And interesting enough, the reason I made this a funnel is more often than not, when you aggregate all these things that you hear, into these categories, it really paints a picture of how effective or what your efficacy is in terms of security and compliance. And more often than not, my findings is that most large organizations, especially financial institutions, that I have no problem telling the CIO that your sort of security and compliance and your audits are basically theater. I've done more detailed presentations on this. So moving on. And so here's another thing. For those of you who have read the Phoenix Project, right, you may or may not know it was a purposeful rewrite on a book written in the 80s called The Goal by Elliot Goldratt. Elliot Goldratt has a lot of publications, but one of the things he has is an audio book that he did 20 years later, and he called it Beyond the Goal. And one of the things he did in that book is he talks about how systems thinking is different from non-systems thinking, or what he says, he talks about physicists or non-social science thinking. And here, let me draw this picture. He says that most people, if you ask them in this graph or this picture, which is the more complicated system, most people who aren't like sort of experts in complex adaptive systems or system thinking would say that it's system B, of course. But the people who understand systems and certainly physicists, which I'm not one, but I've got some friends that are, would say, no, it's system A. And they'll say because system A has more degrees of freedom. System B is actually trying to build a story. It's giving us some directionality. And system A is forcing us to start from scratch. And the way I translate this, and so I want to tie this back to how I learn. I go into an organization and how do I figure out to find out exactly how things are working? Like I said, first stage is I don't talk to the executives. I talk to the people, I call it the edge, the people who are doing the work, fingers on the keyboard. And one of the things you have, certainly as a consultant, now I have this luxury. A lot of times I get brought in because I'm touted as somebody famous, which is nonsense. But John Willis is here. He wrote the DevOps handbook. So I do get some instant credibility. But in general, a lot of times when I go in, people are very defensive. It's the sort of the office space, the Bobs, right? Like, don't tell this John guy anything that will get us in trouble. And so what people tend to do when I ask them questions is, it's fine, job. And they try to give me this sort of system B answer. Like, no, everything's fine. I have an example. How's your CMDB? John, it's great. Now, I don't ask that question because I know I'm going to get like these abstract answers. And I'm using the fine dog here. Well, everything's just great, John. Look, it's really good. I got some warm coffee, the nice bright colors in my room. But the truth of the matter is what I'm looking for is the truth. And the truth, in most cases, there are pockets, not always, of like it's on fire, it's in flames. So I really have to try to decouple this notion of what I would call, Elliot Goldratt would call system A thinking, right? And so I'll give you a good example of, sort of system A versus system B thinking. So we all have heard of the Equifax breach, right? It's popular. It's, if it was in something called Struts 2, it was a parsing, HTML parsing module called Jakarta. If somebody actually understood, they could basically do a curl, hit a server, inject some type of command. If it was authorized, the kill chain starts. Now, the system B answer to this question, particularly from the CEO and even the CIO, which was, oh, this is easy. We know what happened. It was a breach because there was one person, a $5 billion market cap. Or in fact, they lost $5 billion market cap. I don't even remember what their market cap was. Really, it was one person. This is not system thinking, right? That who failed to deploy the patch. But the truth of the matter is, there's a great document done by the Oversight Committee in Congress. If you want to read something fascinating, they went into real detail about all the things that contributed to this breach. And there were so many things far beyond one person not patching. The CISO reported to the chief legal officer. So under testimony, when asked, how come you didn't notify the CIO of the breach? The answer was, I didn't think about it. Like, so know anything about Connolly's Law? Like, that's a classic. That person was bounded to the chief legal officer. So they wanted to make sure everything they thought about, the CISO, right? Like, imagine that, right? Like, talk about not thinking like a software company. And there's just like all the IDS perimeter based had 18-month expired certs. So millions of dollars being wasted on stuff that could have actually seen anomalous behavior, but weren't working because there was some oversight in some scripts that didn't work to actually update the certs, right? I mean, just on and on. And it's the same thing with the Capital One breach, right? Like the sort of System B answer was the attacker was carried out by a former Amazon employer after leasing 2016 maintained. That's nonsense. There's no knowledge that somebody who worked for Amazon in 2016 helped them with this breach, because you know what it was? Again, this is, from external. I have no internal knowledge. I have no sort of NDA or anything like that. This is from research I've done from external. Is there was a team that was in a hurry that needed to put up their own WAF, which wasn't a general WAF that was part of the norm, a prescribed way to do it. They put it up. They took the defaults. They left bypass on. And they absolutely took the default on a particular Amazon server and a VPC group that was authorized. And basically, if you know what this is, with all that, somebody who was just, running scripts against this woman who actually breached it was just running a script continually against everybody, happened to hit the Amazon metadata server and was able to dump all the credentials. And, I don't know if security people say Bob's your uncle, but Bob's your uncle on the kill chain. Right, because it was a server-side, ultimately became a server-side request forgery. So again, the point is that you got to be careful of these abstract answers. You have to sort of dig deeper to find out what all the contributing factors are. So this leads me to sort of the next section in this, which is the title Automated Governance. So I've been working with Gene Kim, co-authored with him a couple of times. We run something called the DevOps Enterprise Summit. We've been doing that since 2014. And then every year around April, Gene invites about 45 or 50 people to Portland. And we work on what we call forum papers, where 6 or 7 of us to get together and we do the research and we turn them into publications. And it's just been amazing. I counted like 30 or 40. Gene says there's 70, but somewhere between 30 or 40 and 70 out there. Just go to IT Revolution, forum papers, amazing resources. 3 resources that have been related to automated governance and really have gotten me on the track of being, maniacally focused on this topic, which was going back to 2015. There was a paper called An Unlikely Union, DevOps and Audit, with the first discussion about how, why DevOps and audit should actually get along, right? This is 2015. And then 2018, a paper called Dear Auditor, and there's actually a GitHub site for this, or possibly a GitLab site, but where it not only is the publication, but all the sort of matrix and manifest of all the things. It's basically an apology letter to auditors. And then it's better than that because it's a bunch of detailed actions related to risk that are listed out. So it's a really worth work. And then last year, I worked on a project I chaired with Nike, Capital One, PNC, Marriott, and Sabre Group, where we worked on this thing called the DevOps Automated Governance, and I'll tell you a little bit about this. So a lot of it stems back from a paper that Capital One wrote a while back, 2017, that sort of sparked my interest in this topic, where they wrote an article about creating better pipelines or focusing on the DevOps pipeline. And there was a subsection in that blog article that talked about pipeline design. And what they said is that in order to sort of be part of the DevOps flow, maybe also being able to have auto commit or sort of auto deploy, a service group had the evidence at the time that they could evidence these 16 opportunities to be gated. And in the pipeline, they would gate these things. Like, did it come with version control? Was there static analysis? You can see the list. And as I was having discussions with people, were like, if you're going to do the gating or enforcement, wouldn't that be a great opportunity at the same time to create evidence, what we call attestations. And so that's what really started this whole discussion with a number of people in the industry. And then around that time, Google introduced an open source project called Grapheus, which was an internal tool that Google was using to do attestation management. I've been told it was for the Google Container Registry, and it was been open sourced, and it hasn't had much use. It's sort of underutilized, could be an amazing tool. So we decided to get together and really create a project, which was this book I talked about that they called the DevOps Automated Governance. Again, there's a couple other people, Sam Guggenheim from Microsoft. So there was a number of people on this project, And so what we did is we sat down, and one of the goals was, could we change subjective attestation or subjective evidence into objective evidence or attestation? So when I say attestation, I mean evidence, right? The only thing is an attestation is typically a signed or a signature, digital signature. And so if you think about how most organizations do audit today, basically what they do is it's very subjective. Somebody creates a change record. They make a proposal for the change. Somebody evaluates that change. Typically, they ask for more subjective evidence of the change. And then there's certainly a number of people that might, and particularly somebody who might be guarding production, who might say, I need this, right? And it's really a sort of a telephone game, right? And then what happens is at audit time, somebody looks at an artifact in production or a change, and they have to follow back this telephone game of subjective conversations. And by the way, humans writing subjective narratives in short form text describing complex adaptive systems, which are most of our systems, is sort of folly in the first place. And so could we actually change that model to be digitally signed evidence in some chain of a link of evidence events, loosely speaking, blockchain, but like it doesn't have to be blockchain, but it has that sort of model. So that at the end of the day, the evidence is a digitally signed list of all the signed evidence. In other words, the commit SHAs, was there a pairing on a pull request associated with the change record, the merge, the build status, the vulnerability status, just on and on and on. I'll show you some examples. And so what you wind up creating is this notion of what we call continuous evidence, right? Where you're sort of balancing the transparency and the evidence, with the risk model that you've set up, hopefully actually from your risk board and enforcement and authorization. And so one of the things that we set out when we were writing this guide, we said, we don't know. It was beautiful because it was started out as a whiteboard exercise, right? And the answer or the question that we were trying to ask is, could we do these three things at the end of this workshop, which was about 3 days? And actually there was some follow-on, a month and a half of follow-on work for the team. But could we shorten the audit time from like 30 days to half a day, or in a continuous evidence model to just continuous? Hit the button, look at the status. Could we increase the efficacy of an audit? So if you think about, the sort of, especially even pre-DevOps or pre-microservices, or what you could call cloud native or modernization, even that's been hard in large institutions to reconcile, what the audits actually say from the subjective descriptions. I always laughed at, they go through the chain, they talk to everybody gets sort of uprooted for a month, a year. And then at the end of the day, the auditors still ask for screen prints, right? So could we change like a 20 to 30% efficacy to 80, 90%? And by the way, could we actually get better at including modernization technologies into this fold, which in my experience in large financial institutions, if you think the disconnect between just standard, pre-agile or waterfall models is disconnected, when people are using sort of cloud native modernization, working with, 15 or 20 or 100 deploys a day, it's just completely disconnected, right? And then third is, if we could accomplish all these things, would we have a better answer for the executive team to say, well, here are the reasons why you possibly could reduce centralized CAB, change advisory authority. So what we did is we sat down and we modeled these boundary points And we weren't trying to create a new model for, the pipeline, the 101 version of a pipeline. We really were creating these 7 stages, if you will, based on how we thought about how you would create attestations, right? Again, evidence control points or control points. We actually call common control points and control points. And so, like, what are the things in the build stage or development stage, the package stage? And you notice we actually include dependency and artifact as part of the process, but we realize that they have their own sort of cycle of cadence. How do you fulfill library dependence, and artifacts actually can have their own independent cycle. So we broke down what we call common controls, common actors, and I won't go through all these. You saw the book; you can get access to it on IT Revolution. It's Creative Commons. But if you look at the control, I think when we were all said and done, we had about 70 or 80 control points. These evidence or attestation evidence. And it was a collaborative. I don't know that one company or one service would use all these, but since all these different companies were contributing, it was sort of a kitchen sink. But like control points for at the source code would like peer review, a percentage unit test coverage, clean dependency, scan for sensitive information. Control points for build would be mutable build, upstream approved dependency store, making sure you have that you have sort of tokenized and you've basically have digitally signed connectivity, so somebody can't man in the middle. Unit testing, linting, security status, dependency, license check, security check, making sure that the artifacts or the libraries are from approved external sources. Library quality check, age, and so I'll go on. And like I said, I'm not going to go through all these and just pick out some at the package. So the other thing we realized, you have to have a package stage, because these days everything's not almost everything, but everything we care about is either a container image, a jar file, or a WAR file, right? And so we realized that actually, from a control point perspective, really merited its own stage. So and so you look at digitally signed images, sort of a secondary vulnerability scan as part of the configuration. There's some, a library is a library, but there are some things about that, especially in sort of Docker files, right? There are some interesting byproducts, especially when you have build and run and those kind of things. Truthful metadata, artifact stage, you get the point, prod stage, on and on and on. And so I wanted to show the sort of GitLab model, because it works perfectly for this, right? So that the whole sort of, the one thing I think most people like about GitLab, and myself, and you notice I'm not giving a presentation shrilling GitLab, right? Because people don't invite me to do that. But I did want to make a call out to one of the things I like about GitLab, and I think a lot of their customers like, is it's all inclusive, right? That's one of their models. They don't use the batteries included mantra that Docker used, but to me, it is that thing that, like, I can use this thing out of the box, but if I need to plug in something specific, like if I want to use another CI/CD, or I want to use another build tool, but this model works really well. And one of the clients that we've been working with is using the GitLab model for the automated attestation. So they have all the ingredients in place to sort of build on top of this. And so it really is a good fit for this automated governance model. And here again, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but if you look at like the different sort of, we tried to map out in the document, like, what would the attestation be? What would the particular source be? Where would the webhook come from? So obviously your source control, or your unit coverage test, or your dependency. And then we went through each one of the build, approved dependency, unit testing, percentage, vulnerability scanning, on and on, right? Again, you'll have a copy of this presentation along with a link to the guide. In the end, what we did is we kind of got near the end of it where we were running out of time, but we created a simple microservice Java Get client that went into Kubernetes, and we stored all the data in Grapheus. We used something called Critis to sort of validate this simple use case. Later on, after we did this, we realized we needed something like Kafka for guaranteed delivery. And then a couple more points I want to make is a couple of clients that I've been working with We're going to create a second version of this project this August with most of the original team and really focus on policy. Because once we had this model in place, we found that you can do some really interesting things. And so one of the companies has really gone really far, what we call policy as code. So once you have that automated attestation model in place, you can then actually start working with, in this case, they start working with the policy people of the bank. So the service delivery team will actually work, in other words, to get involved in this model, which is enforcement and evidence. You go to the policy team, they work out, in this case, a YAML file, a human readable YAML file that is an interface that now, so there's no middleman. You don't have the policy people going to the infrastructure people that go to the automation people. You're literally having the policy people write the human readable defined policy that interacts directly with the automated policy and automated governance model. It's really fascinating. And here's just an example of one of the clients we've worked with, which is integrating that with OPA and Rego as part of the Kubernetes open policy agent stuff. Like, so if you imagine the YAML is the interface, and then we create sort of automatically generated Rego files as the implementation that manage the Kubernetes admin controller and all the great things that OPA does, right? So really cool stuff. Here's sort of a model, a very simplistic model of using sort of Kafka as a wrapper and then having this engine that does enforcement and sort of gating enforcement in evidence, storing the data in Grapheus. There's been some contributions of adding a MySQL background in Grapheus. And then last but not least, another project that was a spin-off of the DevOps Automated Governance, which was a couple of people that were working on some large cloud groups in a working board called ONUG. It's the Open Network User Group, a really large group that works with really large telcos, banks. They contacted me about seeing if we can do some follow-on work. And so we worked on this project in the beginning of this year, and you can see here it's FedEx, it's the Kaiser Permanente, Cigna, and then some of the people that had worked on Duet was VP of Engineering for Goldman, and then so a really large group, another large group of. And here it was a little bit different a spin. It's similar, but what we were looking for is could we get the cloud providers to create attestations back to the consumers? And again, we actually were so successful that there was a write-up in the Wall Street Journal on this, and this is also another Creative Commons document, the automated governance document. And just to go real quickly here, there were 3 objectives for this project. Basically, could we get a unified discussion? And one of the things we were really interested in is we weren't naive enough to say, even though I think if I was trying to calculate this is a rough draft of the buying power of the original team that wrote this book was probably in the the IT spend that was well past 20 billion, maybe 25 billion, and but even with that, we weren't naive enough to say we're writing this paper for the cloud providers. What we wrote this paper for is the community. If we could get the community to agree, then we up to maybe 100 company. Now we're talking, $1 trillion in buying power assets, right? And so the goal was to get the community to buy this, like these 3 things. Every cloud provider has a boot sequence from somewhere from electricity to hypervisor. Typically, cloud providers do not document changes to that. Sometimes the changes to those boot sequence can have effects on scaled tenant resources using that cloud provider. So, and we had some examples from the people on the project that said, yeah, we've seen this. It might change the posture. It might open up adversary opportunities. It could create network routing issues. Typically not, but could. So could we ask all the providers to give us a uniformed signature? Not tell us anything about the boot sequence. That's proprietary. It's IP. But could we get a signature in an event format that we could use, that we could test to see if the boot sequence has changed? And then we could know, the first order primitive of any sort of incident analysis and resolution is what changed. right? So we have some examples. We wrote about that, and the idea was have that in a uniform from all the providers. Second, which was all cloud providers see all ingress requests from a tenant, right? All those API calls. Typically, the way people sort of scrape and manage that is they look at logs, they look at all these things to find out what usage patterns are happening, specifically looking for server-side request forgeries or overrun usage, or somebody put a wrong loop in and created a million of these when it shouldn't have only been about 10. And each cloud provider has a different set of logs, and you have to constantly keep up with the brittle nature of sort of logs and scraping. And so could we ask the providers to provide sort of a mirroring function, like think about an event gateway, like a serverless event gateway, so that everything they see gets spit back to the tenant? And so now you can base, and could we get that in a unit? I know this is crazy talk, but I'll tell you in a minute, the second version, there's a couple of cloud providers that are actually going to be involved in it. So we got their attention. So could we actually sit on an event gateway and then look for things that might show us that there's a server-side request forgery, or somebody's trying to attack us with the wrong metadata by building a crypto miner? And then last but not least, asking the providers to give us a singular view of so each one has their own security center framework. Could we get sort of a unifying view from all the providers? And then two, could they be more centric to the security professional? Because today the security professionals have to do some sort of second and third order investigation to interpret how that relates to a true sort of real security or cyber problem, right? So anyway, I'm going through this really quick. If you're really interested, you can read the guides. Here's some of the graphics here. And then last but not least, just like the YAML example for policy as code, we tried to play a little bit with, in this case, Gherkin. So we created pseudocode loosely based on Gherkin to see if we could at least theoretically write some sort of governance as code to test out our theory about the boot sequence, or this is one for an example of the boot sequence. And again, I'll let you sort of read the document if you're so inclined. And then also this is a pseudocode for sort of a crypto mining fingerprint based on that ingress model, the event gateway ingress model. So anyway, thank you so much. I know it's a lot of material. I went pretty fast. I'm Jay Willis at redhat.com or Bots of the Loop. If you want to talk more about any of these projects, please, I'm always interested in talking to people, and I hope you're really enjoying the conference. Thank you so much.